Hi, folks. Welcome back. Here we are with another recorded lecture. I am your professor, Professor Guerra, and today we're going to be talking about Mexican existentialism. Hopefully you, hopefully you saw, sorry, a little burpy there. Hopefully you saw my previous lecture on the philosophy of Mexican culture, the philosophy of Mexicanness regarding Ramos and Ortega y Gasset, because that kind of really sets up a lot of the stuff that we're going to be sort of saying here, I would say. But without further ado, this is one of my favorite topics. So let's go ahead and get into it, right? Mexican existentialism, sometimes called Mexistentialism. And let me go ahead and shrink my head a little bit. So we'll give a little bit of background on existentialism and its origins in Europe, and we'll talk about existentialism in Mexico. And we're going to talk about basically three themes. In class, we're going to go ahead and be doing a close reading of Uranga in particular. But you can also go ahead and read Villoro or Zea if you think that they interest you more, of course. And we're in each of these philosophers, existentialist philosophers, emphasize different parts of these. They all kind of emphasize them to some extent, but some philosophers emphasize these topics or these themes more than others. Still, I have identified three themes that we can talk about here: the idea of accidentality and insufficiency, zozobra and nepantla, and commitment and responsibility. So let's go ahead and get into it. Oh, and this is Carlos Alberto Sanchez, right here depicted on the right from San Jose State University. He works a lot on Uranga and sort of Mexican, Latin American philosophy, especially Mexican philosophy. So existentialism. So here on the top right, we have a very famous French philosopher, Sartre. I actually forget what his first name is. Sartre is his last name. And here at the bottom right, we have Simone de Beauvoir. But basically, existentialism, right, started in Europe, and it's a philosophical tradition. It focuses on human existence and the meaning of life. They have this very famous quote that existence precedes essence. That means that you necessarily exist first, and then you decide what your sort of meaning of life is, or what you are required to do in life. This is very contrary to, let's say, religion, where your essence, your purpose for be existing, your requirement for being you and being the type of creature that does what you do, comes first in religion. Usually, he would have probably Christianity or Catholicism in mind. They would have Christianity or Catholicism in mind, and then only later do you exist as a creature. In French existentialism, arguably the most mainstream version, the most popular version, it focuses on a radical individualism and the idea of self-creation through choices and overcoming obstacles. In other words, only you can decide what your purpose of life is, what your meaning of life is. No one else can sort of decide it for you. Neither not the government can do it, your parents can do it, and God can do it. You have to exist first and decide for yourself as an individual what you're doing here, existing. There's also an emphasis on the idea that we're thrown into the world and we're responsible for any meaning we find in it. That can often lead to anxiety, dread over death. We are kind of doomed to be free, right? Now, European existentialists, right? They include Soren Kierkegaard. He's from Denmark. He's actually one of my favorite existentialists. He's actually one of the few existentialists who's actually religious. Most of them are not religious. Miguel de Unamuno, Jose Ortega y Gasset, they're from Spain. Nietzsche, German. Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, also German. Jean-Paul Sartre, that's his first name. I forgot his first name. Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and Gabriel Marcel. They're all French. So that's kind of the background, right? You kind of need to decide your own meaning of life, as in there's huge emphasis on the individual, and sometimes that can give rise to feelings of dread or anxiety. Uh, yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate. So existentialism in Mexico, right? Jose Gauss is right there, depicted on the top right. He was actually a Spanish exile from the Spanish Civil War, and what he did is he actually translated Heidegger, the German philosopher, into Spanish in the 1940s. And Heidegger would actually go on to be hugely influential to a lot of these Mexican existentialists. Now, Heidegger sort of gave a guide to an authentic life, or he's a big thing. His philosophy is the idea of Dasein. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Dasein, sort of like really being there in the moment. And in order to sort of really be there in the moment, you need to sort of have an awareness of, according to Heidegger, an awareness that you are actually going to die and everything you love and care for will be over. Not as a sort of matter of fact that one will die, but no, that you individually, your name are going to die and everything you love will be gone. And only once you have sort of death in the mind can you sort of orient your life towards death and live an authentic life. These sort of ideas were, I would say, very influential to a lot of different Mexican philosophers, but especially I would say to Emilio Uranga, which is depicted here on the bottom right. And he claims that yes, he was initially very influenced by Heidegger, but he also claims that Mexico began to shift towards sort of French existentialism. And in his famous essay, Two Existentialisms, he kind of talks about how a lot of German existentialism, like Heidegger's, was sort of very almost scientific and rigorous, and it focused a lot on sort of methodology. Um, but that the Mexican ethos at the time would be sort of became dissatisfied with it, and they sort of embraced a more, I guess you can say, romantic or passionate existentialism that we find in the French existentialism. He says, for my generation, more concretely, for the Hyperion group, a group that he and a bunch of others founded, what really matters is to know how Sartre deals with moral themes and not with how Heidegger will identify being or nothingness in his work. That's another theme, big theme in French existentialism. It focuses a lot more on living morally or just sort of living day to day, while Heidegger in his existentialism, it's very, very, very technical. Not saying anything against Heidegger again, initially very influential, but he thinks that he and other philosophers sort of moved away from being heavily influenced from Heidegger to being influenced from Beauvoir, Camus, and Sartre. Now, let's get into the actual themes of Mexican existentialism, right? So Luis Villoro here is depicted on the top right, and Leopoldo Zea is depicted on the bottom right. And yeah, I would say existentialism was immediately popular in Mexico as Mexicans saw a philosophical position that could sort of make sense of their existence as Mexicans. Remember, a big theme in the philosophy of the Mexican was sort of rejecting the idea that that if there is a universal idea, we should just accept it blindly, but we need to sort of adapt it to our situation. Again, at this point, the Mexico and a lot of Latin America has gone through a lot of what they would call failed projects. The failed project of scholasticism, the failed project of liberalism and Enlightenment philosophy, and the failed project of positivism, right? And again, when I say failed projects, I mean failed to varying degrees depending on the nation. But there was a, at least in Mexico, there was a dissatisfaction with them. So they wanted to sort of get a sense of identity and make sense of their existence. Now, for Zea, who's in the bottom right here, the motto existence precedes essence gave a justification, he thinks, for privileging the concrete over the abstract, or the particular over the universal, or the contingent over the permanent. For Villero, on the top right, he says that existential philosophy, or he believes that existential philosophy, which directs itself to being and not merely to becoming, gives us the adequate instruments to validate our work, our obras, our day-to-day life, our labors. Over its explicit project of revealing being itself, we place, according to him, transforming of being in a sense both individual and social. So this idea of sort of becoming yourself in French philosophy and European philosophy, it's a very individualistic thing. But as we're going to see here for a lot of Mexican philosophy, it becomes a very collective, and yeah, it becomes a very collective thing. So the first theme, horrible theme, accidentality and insufficiency. There's an idea in Mexican philosophy and Mexican existentialism that Europeans' culture and European philosophy, as well as American culture, American philosophy, sort of present themselves as fully formed, permanent, and substantial is the word that they use. Substantial sort of meaning enough, right? So to quote them, to quote the article for this week. We, the Europeans and Americans, exist without having to discover or create who we are. We will exist forever. We exist with meaning and purpose at birth. So the idea here is that America, let's just use America as an example. America, and I guess you could say this of Europe too. America was not an accident. America was purposefully built, and it was purposefully built because it was a God-given mission to establish democracy and these liberal ideals and these new continent. And it follows God's plan. It follows God's plan. However, there's a sense that in Mexican philosophy that Mexicans are sort of thrown into a world and they're kind of shipwrecked like a ship on the shore into reality and abandoned into existence due to being a essentially a historical accident. So if you want to think of like children, right? America and Europe, they're the planned babies, and Mexico was the accidental baby, right? The still a blessing, let's say, but the accidental baby. And by what they mean by historical accident is that they were a result of colonization, right? Um, they were not meant to be created, but it just so happens that they were created due to European culture and Mesoamerican culture sort of mixing together. It is, in other words, a byproduct, not something purposeful. Again, compare this to the Enlightenment philosophy of Europe, or just that and the idea of manifest destiny in America. Manifest destiny being the idea that the United States should, go from sea to shining sea and take away all the land from the natives and Mexicans and other people who get in the way, because they are the chosen people by God. They have a purpose right at the inception, not just as individual Americans, but collectively as America. They have a purpose in existing. Um, they're the chosen people. Their existence was non-existent, but it's part of a divine or humanistic plan to spread democracy or American ideals everywhere. Now, here we have some very beautiful quotes. I would say very beautiful quotes from Uranga. He says the accident, right, living in an accident is fragility. It's an oscillation, a moving back and forth between being and nothingness. These means that its fit in being is that its adhesion to being expressed in the modality of being in is not protected by an inalienable right. He's not using that term by accident, inalienable right, but rather whatever may be the form of its inheritance, it is always revocable. So there is a sense from this first quote, right? And obviously, I want you to sort of try to figure out what this first quote means by yourself. But if I'm taking a stab at it, there is a sense that when you are an accident, your life or the idea of being accidents, right, that you were not sort of planned, you were just sort of a result of colonization and this other stuff, also makes you fragile. Why does it make you fragile? Well, if you were planned and you were planned by God or some type of divine plan, God or some type of divine agent is there to sort of protect you to make sure that you fulfill your destiny. But there is no such protector when you are an accident. And because of that, you're going to be much more fragile. Your existence came about as an accident, and it can just as easily be snuffed out due to another accident. And really, at this point, really think, right? Urango's writing in the 1940s, and at this point in the Mexico, there's just been so much bloodshed from so many wars and revolutions that they kind of are accepting this idea of death or fragile life as kind of just a given in their socioeconomic circumstances. The accident, he continues in another quote, is constantly threatened by displacement or desalojamiento. Attached to being, it can always be torn off from its there or exterminated. Yeah, obviously, he's talking about death, but he's kind of talking about sort of an existential, metaphysical death. And also a collective death, right? Mexico can cease to exist. It could be destroyed. It could be usurped. There could be a violent coup, and Mexico could be gone tomorrow. Whatever it holds onto, whatever handle it grabs onto, can be removed. It was born to be in and at the same time to not be in. I'm not sure what that last line means. I'll leave it for you to sort of figure out and grapple with it yourself. And, we'll talk about it in the close reading in class. Yes, what does this mean in your own words? Grapple with it. He speaks very poetically, I think very beautifully, and I struggle myself to try at times to try to figure out what it is that he's trying to say here. But again, the idea is that accidentality is kind of something like impermanence or randomness or being insubstantial or not enough. That is, you in Mexico, because he's talking to Mexicans, exist today, but you may not exist tomorrow. Your identity and circumstances were not predetermined by some God or divine plan, and some God or divine plan doesn't protect your existence. Your existence was just arbitrarily given to you. You do not have a built-in purpose. You have to find it and you have to create it. And again, what's interesting, right, is that this is something that we know in existentialism, in French and German existentialism, but in French and German existentialism, it's applied to the individual. Here, it's actually being applied to the whole country and to your whole peoples. Your whole country is an accident, and it can just as easily be destroyed tomorrow. Substantiality is the idea of being absolutely self-sufficient, of being enough from the moment of birth, or as lacking nothing for their purpose in life and continued existence. That's the idea of substantiality. And what's very interesting is that he believed, or according to Mexican existentialism, that is just a straight up lie. Substantiality is a lie. And people sort of delude themselves into thinking that they, as an individual, or moreover, that they as a people are substantial. And that is a delusion, that is a lie. To apply this to the Americans in particular, Americans might tell themselves, like, yes, we're going to continue existing in America, the greatest nation ever, blah, 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 blah. It's our God-given right to spread from sea to shining sea. That's all a lie. That is all a delusion. Your existence, your collective existence as America could be wiped out tomorrow. In other words, right, the Roman Empire, often thought to be a great civilization in the West, didn't last forever. Eventually, it collapsed. The same will eventually happen to Mexico. They think that's obvious, but also it will happen to Europe and it will happen to the United States, to America. Now, recognizing the lie of substantiality, that this is a lie that's been fed to you, gives us the idea of insufficiency, of not being enough. And the idea is that Mexicans are, or people in general are, because he's eventually going to apply this to all civilizations, are at their very core not enough to have meaning and continue their existence infinitely. Um, and what's interesting, right, is that he thinks that Mexico, because of its social circumstances and because its political upheavals, so many political upheavals, they are in a unique situation to figure out that they have a sort of this collective insufficiency, that they at their very core don't have enough power to stave off death that might be right around the corner. And again, they don't mean universal death, but they mean a death to their whole nation. And it's hubris to think, or the term he uses is arrogance. It's arrogance to think that you can fend off whatever tomorrow might bring, and you can infinitely fend off death. And it's a little, yes, it's a little depressing, but it's also by being a little depressing, it's also a little sort of freeing. I think this Mexican existentialist philosophers are trying to tell us here. You are thrown into this world in which you are a historical accent, and you are by birth, again, as an individual, but also as a collective, as your nation, not enough to find meaning in life and even continue your own existence. You are fragile. The result is not to despair, though. The proper response is actually to take responsibility for your world, the world that you did not choose to enter or commit yourself to. Why? Because this is your only way to find meaning or purpose or to become enough for yourself. Now, what's interesting here, right? In order to do that, when you take responsibility of your world, you are essentially taking responsibility of your historical situation, and people are a part, your peers are a part of that historical situation. So we're going to see here, right, that for French and German ideal existentialism, taking responsibility of your individual life is a big thing, but for them, it's taking responsibility of your collective life, your life as it relates to your nation, very much your nation, but also as it relates to your community. And here, we Tyler kind of already alluded to this. Is it true that the European American truly are inherently purposeful and self-sufficient? Well, no. No, they are not. They sort of lie to themselves through ideology or propaganda. They delude themselves into thinking that they are purposeful. And again, he calls them an arrogant substantiality, an arrogant, kind of like a pompous or conceited way of thinking that you are enough to fend off death or to make plans to fend off the collapse of your nation eventually in the long term. It's arrogant. It is extremely arrogant. What is interesting is that he thinks that all human existence, or Mexican extensions believe that all human existence, individual as well as collective, is accidental and insufficient. In other words, all individual life is an accident. No one planned you. No one. If at least if you go back far enough, maybe your individual parents planned you, right? But at least in terms of collectives, right, and communities, they're all accidental. No one planned them. No God or divine being. And they're all insufficient. What does that mean? It means that all of these communities will eventually, in due time, die off. They will collapse. The Mexican, interestingly, according to Mexican existentialism, just sees it better. They see this accidentality and insufficiency that it infuses all civilizations. They just better able to see that because of their history of turmoil, of political and social and economic turmoil. The historical circumstances of the European, however, a lot of success, a lot of colonialism that benefited them, blinds them to this truth. They can't see that America or Europe could collapse tomorrow. Or maybe not tomorrow, but in the next few years or in a century or I don't know, in the future. That is Europe and America exist today, but they may not tomorrow. It is a self-deception that simply being born America gives your life enough meaning. It does not. Now here's the second thing, the Zobra and Nepantla. So this comes from the Nahuatl concept of Nepantla, or Nepantla is a Nahuatl or Mexica concept. By Mexica, again, we're referring to the Aztecs. Now, the Nepantla designates a sort of in between or in the middle or in the center. That's roughly what it translates to. It's basically a situation or circumstance you find yourself in. And what's interesting is that this is heavily also applied to not only situations and circumstances, but also to identities, where you are torn between two worlds. For Mexicans, they found themselves in the Pantla, particularly between indigeneity, Mexica, and Spanishness or Europeanism. Now, European the pamphlet creates a constant oscillation or sort of ungroundedness where you sort of are rootless and you're constantly always sort of sleeping. It's hard to balance yourself. You're kind of always going back and forth. Why? Because indigeneity makes certain demands of you and requires certain loyalty of you, but Spanishness or Europeanness similarly makes certain demands of you as well. Now, what's interesting is that according to Mexican existential philosophy, again, Mexicans in this time are particularly uniquely situated to figure out that they're always in this sort of in between, being pulled from multiple sides and multiple identities. But this actually applies to everybody. This applies to everyone. Everyone is always being pulled apart or not pulled apart, pulled to and fro, back and forth by multiple identities. And we always have sort of this shifting ground underneath us. It's actually a delusion to think that your identity is not in the pantalla, not in oscillation, not being constantly renegotiated between one identity and another identity. To think that you are American and America is a static identity, or sorry, to think that you are American and being American is a static identity that means XYZ and you know it, and there's no oscillation or navigation or renegotiating of that identity, that is delusion, they would say. You are constantly renegotiating your life between one identity and another, whatever those identities may be. Uh, so here's another example. For the Mexican American identity, Americans might call you a beaner or some other slur, right? Derogatory term. They're fully accepting you, but Mexicans might call you a pocho or pocha or whitewash, and they're fully accepting you sort of as well. So they all kind of make certain demands of you, sometimes by by insulting you. The American identity was once in the Pantla, right? Where it was caught between the identity of being colonists and being British citizens, but now they have sort of, according to Mexican existentialism, kind of deluded themselves into thinking that they are no longer in the Pantla. You can come up with many other situations of the Pantla as well. So the question that you should ask yourself, right, is, well, Mexican existentialism would say, yes, you 100% find yourself in the Pantla, whether you realize it or not. Your identity is never not in oscillation, never not being constantly renegotiated. But do you agree? Do you find yourself in the Pantla? And if you do, what are sort of two identities that you find make different demands of you? And how do you sort of navigate that, right? Yeah. Now, here's a second term, right? Zozobra. It basically means something like anxiety of not knowing where one stands at any one time. Oranga, Emilio Oranga defined as follows: a not knowing on which extreme to depend on, or what is the same, a dependence of the two extremes of your identity, grasping at both ends of the chain. It kind of makes you a little dizzy, but also makes you a little anxious. Mexican American identity, zozobra, would psychologically sound something like this. Am I acting for Mexican Americans in particular? Am I acting too white? Am I acting not white enough? Am I speaking too Am I acting too American or not Mexican enough? Am I speaking too much Spanish, too little Spanish? Am I coming off as whitewashed? Am I not in touch with my Mexican roots enough? Am I not succeeding the American dream enough? If you start asking yourself this question, you start getting sort of like a little dizzy or a little anxious. Well, that is zozobra. Luis Villoro adds, the privileged sense of Zobra reveals the accidentality of being itself and of the world. This one appears as insubstantial and fragile. We thus try to flee from our own insubstantiality by seeking substance. Again, the Zobra can often feel not good. So we try to sort of lie to ourselves and say that our identity is sort of set in stone. But again, that's a delusion. Your life and your identity is constantly being renegotiated, and to sort of stop renegotiating it is to sort of give up and again be lying to yourself. Anxiety feels bad. It feels bad to navigate in between identity. It is a lot of work. So often we run away from it. We latch onto Mexicanness or static Mexicanness or static Americanness, whatever it is. Um, but fleeing always fails. It's never going to work. As mentioned before, why is it going to fail? Well, because eventually you're going to be forced due to your social circumstances to have to renegotiate it. Either someone's going to ask you, let's say that you think you're American, you have the static American identity. Eventually, someone's going to say that you're being, in some way or shape or form, that you're being too American, not American enough, or someone else is going to make a demand of you to be less American in some way, shape, or form. And then the oscillation will begin again. Fleeing always fails. We just have to constantly oscillate it and renegotiate our identities. Now, as mentioned before, the ideal response is not fleeing, but commitment and responsibility. So let's go ahead and get into those last theme, right? So the idea is that you are thrown into the world and you're thrown into the world and it's an accident, right? You didn't choose your And I mentioned this earlier, right? Maybe if your parents planned you, right? That's in the sense you're not an accident. But even as an individual, even if your parents planned you, you're still an accident in the sense that you didn't get to choose your setting that you were born into, or your class, or your race, or ethnicity. That is all chance. In other words, that is all an accident. So even you as an individual baby that went through Planned Parenthood, that your parents went to Planned Parenthood, you're still an accident. And Mexican existentialists would say that in the most loving of ways. Now, yes, this is unfair, right? You didn't get to choose any of this life. You just were born. You didn't get to choose anything. But no one is going to create meaning for your life. Not God, not your nation, not some universal human essence, not some divine plan. Only you can create that meaning. In other words, you must take responsibility for your situation, but at the same time, right? When German and French idealism, existentialism says that you have to take responsibility for your individual life, Mexican existentialism goes a bit further. You also have to take responsibility for others as well, for others in the past and present. Why? Because you're all sort of interconnected. Only in taking responsibility for them will you have a chance. You are yourself plus your circumstances. If you do not save your circumstances, you do not save yourself. In order to save yourself, you're going to need the help of other people because you don't exist in a vacuum and there's no chance you can save yourself and there's no chance they can save themselves by working individually. You need to sort of unite. Leopoldo Zeo writes, in this sense, every person is a committed agent, that is, inserted, thrown, or placed in a world in which one must act and for which one must be responsible. Uranga tells us there is no world which is pure, neither there is there pure consciousness, rather there is always a consciousness in a situation or commitment, which means that once a thrownness toward the world and the possibility to return to it, so as to require consciousness of the sense and essence of our commitment. Zay, I think this might be the last quote, ends by saying we have to take responsibility for our past, not of our making. Yet at the same time, with our attitude, whatever it might be, we commit and take responsibility for our future that must be made by us. In this way, we're responsible for others in the presence of others. We didn't choose, so this is a very easy example, right? If you're born today, you didn't choose for the fact that, older generations kind of destroyed the environment and you're in an environmental crisis. But to be bitter and say, oh, well, I didn't choose that, and now I'm curmudgeonly and I'm going to run away from my responsibility, that's not going to give your life any meaning. The only thing that's going to give your life meaning is to take responsibility for what the world has sort of thrown at you. In other words, to take responsibility for what others in the past have given to you. So in that sense, your life and your meaning is always going to be connected to other people. And in the past, but also to other people here in the present. Because there's no way you can save the environment just by working individually, right? This, in short, is the essence of commitment. Responsibility for others in the past, and responsibility for others right now in the presence of others. Okay. Concluding remarks. European existentialism saw thrown into the world as grounds for a radical individualism. Mexican existentialism saw thrown as grounds for commitment to one's historical circumstances, including other people. For Villorozan or Oranga, existentialism was a move towards a more engaged existence, not towards a radical isolation in the loneliness of existence, a la Camus, a French philosopher. It is understood in terms of accidentality and insufficiency, being not being enough, nepantla, and zozobra. And commitment and responsibility. Sorry. Interesting enough, Mexican exceptionalism can transcend Mexico. It can show us how non-Mexican identities are also accidental, how they also suffer from Nepantla, or maybe not suffer, how they go through Nepantla and Zobra, and how they also have to commit and take responsibility. But okay, that is it for today, folks. Uh, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you folks next time. Take it easy. Bye bye.